Today we look at the second part of the long 16th century in European history. We have been looking at the economic organizations and activities of the 16th century. In the long history of capitalism in Europe, from the 14th to the 18th century, 16th century occupies a very important milestone. From the late medieval ages, there were some changes in the artisanal and family-based production system. The appearance of the clothier in the textile industry marks a definite change in the older form of organization. It was the beginning of a process when the capital and labor were being divided. The clothier or the early merchant capitalist would invest capital, would pay wages to someone and market the products. Thus, he was trying to bring the entire process of production under his control. It is, however, important to notice that the system, it took a time and there had been a process of contestation between the two systems of production. Brodel says that the capitalist system of production, which was a new phenomenon, was to be seen in the relation of capital to a set of economic activities and in the hierarchical structure of commerce. He looks at this hierarchical structure of commerce at the level of the daily life, in the economic life where there is some sense of competition, and in the sheer organization of the new capitalist mode of production. Brodel finds this, or shall we say, illustrates this point in the sphere of the grain trade. Grain was a source of food and therefore a part of the daily life. Grain was exported to the nearby town for selling them, for marketing them. So grain was also a commodity, and there was an exchange. And finally, grain trade could travel over long distance occasionally in times of famine or failure of crop. And this long distance travel of the grain trade would require a larger amount of capital. This is where the merchant capitalist would come in. It is this movement from one stage to the other that gradually lays down the path of the transition. And at every stage, we find new agents and new participants in the production processes, in the production organization, and also in marketing. The capitalist system was first used in the Artisanal Production factories in Venice. This was under government control. It was over a huge area, about 60 acres. The government decided the working hours and the wages. But while this was done at the same time, there were individual artisanal production in place as well. In many places, these individual artisans produced commodities like shoes, gloves, hats, small metal, and they were also busy in tailoring. It has to be remembered that this participation of the artisanal mode of production, of the artisans themselves, or the existence of the cottage or family-based production was predicated on the fact that manufacturing literally meant using hands for production, for manufacturing. So there was still the need of a labor to produce things, and there was still very little use of machines. Let us move on to the position of the capitalist mode of production as it started emerging during this period. From the late medieval period, one organization where certain changes facilitated this was the old guild system. The guild system's regulations were being more vigorous because the masters were now demanding more money for a journeyman to become a master, The masters often became or behaved like the producers and used these journeymen increasingly as wage earners. In this way, within the older organization, a change was gradually taking place which favored the emergence of the capitalist mode of production. A second area where the changes in organization could be seen had been in the towns. The trend was most noticeable in the textile production, as the towns were the areas where the textile production was centered. This was seen in the textile industry of Flanders, in the older kind of textile industry in Italy. Textile industry depended to a large extent on export, and it also depended on supply of raw materials which sometimes came from distant areas, like in Persia and Turkey. Now, as this trade became dependent on the long-distance trade, it required more capital, and this is where the merchant capitalist, or who was called the Clothier in England, arrived. These men supplied the capital. The producer was still independent and by and large owned the means of production, but gradually the processes and means of production even were being controlled by these merchant capitalists who invested the capital. The third type where this transition can be noticed is in the rural areas. This is where we find the beginning of what has been called the putting out system. The clothier or the merchant capitalist comes in here, he invests capital, he buys up the product and markets it. Gradually, he takes control of the entire process. This was first seen in the Flanders region, Netherlands, Germany, and England. In England, these men were known as the clothiers. It is this clothier who economic historians would describe as an example or a representative of economic individualism. He not only supplied raw material, paid kind of wages to the artisanal producer and bought up the product and marketed them. He also introduced some kind of machines like the gig mill, which facilitated a quickening of the production process. He had a number of looms which he could lend out to the artisans or the weavers. And in some cases, this is very significant, he brought within, under a single roof, different processes like dyeing, weaving, etc. And there are some kind of proto-factories, quote unquote, where even 100 people worked together for the purpose of production. So in this way, in different spheres, there was a gradual process of change. There was a gradual change in the organization of production and in the mode of production, and the new mode was increasingly what is known as the capitalist mode of production. This obviously affected manufacturing and the entire production system. First of all, we had to look at the textiles. The textiles, the metal extraction, everywhere these changes were noticed. Augsburg was a famous center for textile, and the Fugger family had been a phenomenal business family. They built up virtually an empire of textile trade centering on this area. They also imported silver, nearly 1,400 tons. In the last decade of the 15th century, it went up to 1,625 tons. In the second decade of the 16th century, and it came down to about 1,100 tons by the 1530s. They were controlling the textile area, the textile trade. They were bringing textile and even bullion to Antwerp, which was emerging as a new center of trade. Germany and Netherlands retained their importance in craft production. England and France were gradually becoming significant. The older centers of production in the process experienced a certain decay. Textile, as we have noted earlier, retained a central position. It was important for employment and for income generation. England was in the process becoming changed from a producer of wool to a producer of woolen cloth. There was a new kind of cloth called the new draperies, because the wool supply had become, particularly from the coastal region, had decayed. There had been an accent on the new draperies which were lighter compared to the older draperies which were heavier clothes. And the new draperies were beginning to capture the markets. One historian has called this the result of commercialization of rural industries or of rural technology. Flanders had been the important center. It gradually shifted to Hornschute and then to Leiden. From the north, these had been brought over to the south as well, and they had been new markets for the new draperies as well. Changes in the structure helped the linen textile as well. France, Flanders, and Germany took a very leading role in this trade as well. The main centers of textile trade had been the cities, but in the second half of the century, it was extended to the rural areas as well. In production of commodities like linen, there had not been a problem of raw material, and therefore the artisanal producers retained their independence to a great extent in this. Even in the linen industry, the independence of the artisanals gradually became dependent on the capitalists. Turning to the metal industries, which were becoming very important, we have iron, copper, silver. Iron industry was picking up gradually, and it was believed that over the century the production was about 70,000 tons. Furnaces were being built now, and technology spread from Italy to the north. There were many centers in Central Europe, in Germany, for example, and a total of about 10,000 people were employed here. The silver mines started working towards the end of the medieval period, but the centers of this was Thuringia, Dresden, and the Carpathian Mountains. These are the basic mining areas. Production declined over the century from 96 tons in the 1526-35 period to about 24 tons in the 1620s. Obviously, the bullion that was coming from America was a disincentive to further investment in the silver mining. Production of copper increased till the second decade and declined thereafter. It went down from 1,600 tons in the first decade to about 700 tons in the last decade. The reduced demand is attributed to inflation and price rise. Main centers were in Tyrol, North Hungary, parts of Italy. Sweden emerged as an important producer in the century. The old structure did not continue in metal extraction. Introduction of new technology required capital, and therefore the merchant capitalist was making his presence felt. In Neuschal, for example, the Thuso and the Fugger family invested considerable capital. In Tyrol, the copper mines employed about 11,000 labor in mid-century. Nuremberg had a great reputation for producing fine instruments and metal utensils. England had a lead in coal mining. Now we look at trade, its organization, and its fluctuations. There was considerable extension of both internal and external trade in the 16th century. The Mediterranean was losing control gradually, and the movement upwards was noticeable. The movement included the gradual emergence of Antwerp as the main center of internal trading networks and the external trading networks. By the 15th century, the Italians had reached Bruges or Southampton in the northern part of Europe, following the Atlantic route of Gibraltar. Commodities came from Germany and Eastern Europe to Antwerp. Luxury items from the south came to Antwerp, the Atlantic commodities came to Antwerp. After 1570, English ships started going into the Mediterranean region, carrying commodities from the north. Previously, Italy imported wool, but now increasingly north, Netherlands in particular, started importing wool from Spain and glue from Italy. So from a producer of luxury items, a procurer of spices, the Mediterranean region now became also a supplier of raw material, and a certain decay of their older trading network was seen, and it was to a large extent completed in course of the 16th century. There were some interesting features in the organization of trade. Eastern Europe now mainly exported food grains, cattle, copper, etc. And in return, it received from the West textiles, metal fabrication, and other industrial products. Overseas trade there were changes in this sector as well. Trade was mostly in bullion and spices. In 1594, bullion accounted for 90% of the Spanish trade. Spain also started exporting silk, wine, etc. to America. By 1570s, 50% of export or 50% of import of silver was spent on exports. Sometimes the merchants made a great profit. For example, spices imported were sold at 3 times their prices, but they failed to invest this in the business, in the production system. So there was no innovation, and gradually it kind of acquired a stasis, and stagnation prevailed, and there was a decline ultimately. Overseas trade was initially conducted within the existing structure, but in the 16th century, what was apparent was an appearance of inequalities. This was the result of the emergence of what has been called the European world economic system. Europe was now divided into a core area, periphery, and some would say the semi-periphery. The core was Western, Northern, and parts of Central Europe. In plain terms, Germany, England, France, Holland, etc. And the core had been the Eastern Europe and America. They provided bullion and the raw materials, and the western part of the core area produced the industrial goods, all industrial commodities. So there was some kind of a division of labor, of capital and labor. West was becoming increasingly capital intensive with capitalist mode of production. The East regenerated into a feudal system once more. In the West, as a result, labor was still free, whereas in the East, labor depended on serf labor or slave labor occasionally. In other words, it was captive labor, and wealth came to be concentrated in the western part of Europe. A very significant happening of this century was the emergence of Antwerp as the major center of business. The trading networks seemed to merge in Antwerp, which had become an emporium. Commodities like copper, silver, timber, grain, spices, and luxury goods all tended to come to Antwerp. German and Dutch merchant capitalists helped the process. It grew in the first half of the century. In the first half of the 16th century, from the second half, it experienced certain decline because of political turmoil, and its place was taken increasingly by Amsterdam. And later on, it shifted to London. Now, a very significant change that one notices here is the emergence of merchant companies. The company, as Brodel has told us, emerges from 2 words, com, which means together, panis, which means bread. So the etymological meaning of company is breaking bread together. It meant reducing the risk and providing the capital jointly, because increasingly the capitalist system had a voracious appetite for capital. There was a new Ravensburg company as early as the late 14th century. Some of them continued, but it did not continue beyond the mid-15th century. This is an example of what has been called joint liability companies. The risk was shared, but the risk that was shared was unlimited. The next stage was the limited liability company, where there was partnership of both individuals and capital. And finally came the joint stock companies, where there was partnership of capital. Now, the joint stock companies had a numerous proliferation in the course of the 16th and the 17th centuries. In the 16th century, England started in the late 15th century. Merchants of the staples and the merchant adventurers, but the really important companies were the Russian Company in 1555, the Levant Company in 1581, the English East India Company in 1600, and the United East India Company of the Dutch in 1595. There were also other innovations in exchange, the bills of exchange, for example, or double entry bookkeeping. So new banks were coming up, credit mechanism was changing, exchange of credit was probably more facile than before. So in a way, the entire structure of trade was gradually changing along with the organization of industry and manufacture. Now we come to the last part of the economic activities, namely agriculture. There was a crisis in the medieval period which led to conversion of agriculture to pasture land. Now in the 16th century, there was a gradual demand in the food grains because of demographic growth. There was need to change again into agricultural lands, but this was not possible everywhere. Enclosure was a problem. As a result, there was an accent on reclamation of land by cutting forests, clearing forests, or by reclaiming swampy lands. This is what happened in the Netherlands. In northern Netherlands, huge dikes were erected on the coast, along the coast, to prevent water from coming in, and the swamp was reclaimed. As much as 48,000 acres were reclaimed in this area. The normal trend of expansion of agriculture was the norm rather than intensive agriculture. Crisis in the medieval period obliged some agricultural land to be transferred to enclosed land for sheep pasture. Agricultural land was also used for production of grape for wine or fruit. But in the 16th century, demographic growth led to a greater demand for food grains, but it was difficult to reconvert the pasture land into agricultural land. So the accent was on reclaiming land from the swampy land, expansion by clearing forest, and going into the remote hilly regions to convert them to agricultural land. The Zimmern Chronicle of 1550 contains all this information in their all clarity. There was a great difference between the organization of agriculture, expansion, or whether it was intensive or extensive. It was more an expansion of agriculture than intensive agriculture. But there was a basic difference again between the West and the East. In the West, there was an increasing bit of commercialization and coming of capital here. But in the East, there was a process of what has been called re-feudalization. In the case of industrial organization, there was some freedom of the players in the western part, but in the East, the landlords reconsolidated their hold over the peasants, and the peasants were virtually converted into serfs. This is what has been called a re-feudalization of Eastern Europe. Enclosure in the first half of the century was a problem. In England, Sir Thomas More had conjured the vision of sheep devouring men. There will be more sheep than men in England. It was necessary for production of wool. But when there was a reduction in the demand for wool, enclosure became less attractive, yet there was not immediately a reconversion to agricultural land. There was instead what is known as emergence of what is known as up and down husbandry. Agriculture or enclosure and animal husbandry together. As a result, when later these were reconverted to agricultural lands, they were very fertile because they received manure for a very long time. On the other hand, there was introduction of new crops as well. Like in England, they introduced mulberry, sainfoin, fodder, and different kind of oils. There were also seeds of change within the traditional structure of agriculture. Many thought that enclosure led to higher prices of food grains and food scarcity, unemployment, and migration. Enclosure had a bad press, but enclosure, we had noticed earlier, had also provided for certain opportunities. The problem of enclosure became less from the mid-century. Enclosure was not profitable anymore, as we have noticed, and agriculture became more profitable in many ways. It resulted in commercialization, increasing commercialization of agriculture. And Mark Bloch, the famous historian, has described it as victory of agrarian individualism. Open fields were joined, and those landlords who could afford it bought further land to consolidate their holdings. And this fenced land became the symbol of the new age in Europe.